Craig. So we've got on the line here, folks, right now, we've got Craig Shirley from Shirley and Bannister Public Affairs. He's a Reagan biographer. He's written several excellent books about Ronald Reagan, detailing his presidency and his rise in the conservative movement. And we've also got, he's also working on, and this will be coming out later this year, so everybody go and pre-order it if you can right now on Amazon or anywhere else, is the Last Act, which is the important final chapter in the life of Reagan that no one has thus far covered. It's the kind of book that widens our understanding of American history and of the presidency and the men who occupied it. So Craig goes through all the different details from the Reagan Foundation and the library and walks through and really tells the story of the final Reagan years. Craig, you had this interesting column this week in the townhall.com that walks through how what we're seeing out of Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker is a lot like what we saw out of Ronald Reagan. Can you walk us through that?
Sure, Matt. By the way, it's good to be with you tonight. I see, historical parallels, and they're really, it's not so much a rule, more like a guideline, but between Jimmy Carter's SALT II treaty with the Soviets and Barack Obama's nuclear treaty with the Iranians, is that Carter was bound and determined, as you remember, in 1979 and 1980, to abide by the terms of the SALT II treaty, even though, interestingly enough, the Senate hadn't yet ratified it. And it was a bipartisan coalition was emerging opposed to it, including Democratic Senator John Glenn of Ohio and Democratic Senator Fritz Hollings of South Carolina, and of course Reagan, as well as most of the Republican and all of the conservative establishment. But Carter was bound and determined to abide by it, even after the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, which made it especially interesting. Carter, at the time, after the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, he sat down for an interview with Barbara Walters, and he said that he misunderstood and misjudged the Soviet intentions, which was an astonishing confession by the President of the United States, the leader of the free world, and somebody who'd been in the Oval Office for over 3 years. So, and of course, as the Soviet hegemony grew and the Soviet aggression grew, political support for SALT II waned. So that actually by the fall of 1980, something interesting happened, which was that not just a plurality, a majority of Americans wanted not nuclear parity with the Soviets, but they wanted nuclear superiority. So by the fall of 1980, the public, in terms of their hawkishness on national defense spending and our military posture, had swung over to the Reagan position, which explains in large part why he defeated Carter in 1980. But there's a lot of parallels between Carter's beloved SALT II and Barack Obama's. I think that presidents are often, not always, but often motivated by their place in history, especially when they get into their second term, especially when they're thinking about, how history is going to regard them. They want signing ceremonies on the South Lawn. They want treaties ratified. They want to go down in history as peacemakers. And I think that's right now uppermost in Barack Obama's mind right now, instead of what would largely be regarded by most people as at best a flawed treaty with the Iranians.
So not only, I think not only are we seeing the comparison between President Obama in the last years of Jimmy Carter, but I also think we're seeing some parallels inside the Republican primary as well.
Yes.
And I think there was a really good column, I think it was in the Weekly Standard not too long ago, that walked through how there's really two powerhouse candidates on the Republican side right now. And not to discount Mr. Trump and some of the other candidates out there right now, but I mean the two guys who are governors or senators who are really in there in the top tier with him in the polling are Scott Walker and Jeb Bush. And
yes.
In this column in the Weekly Standard, I forget who it was that wrote it. I think it might have been Bill Kristol, or it might have been one of their other reporters or editors, walks through how Jeb Bush is acting a lot like his father, George H.W. Bush, who obviously eventually became Ronald Reagan's vice president, and Scott Walker's acting a lot like Ronald Reagan during that primary. Can you walk through those comparisons? So it's not just across the two parties, but it's also inside the Republican Party.
Yeah, it's actually fascinating, Matt. Again, it goes to the point earlier is that history doesn't always repeat itself, but there are strong guidelines to suggest that it does replicate itself, and that Reagan was a Midwesterner, ran as a populist. By 1980, he'd become a fully developed American conservative, and I would say that, say, in 1976 and 1964, he was not fully developed as an American conservative. He was more of an beginner, against college students or protesting college students or against faculty or against radical students on campus or whatever. But by 1977, he begins to develop a much more optimistic form of conservatism, so that he's not, he's seeing the dawn instead of the dusk. He's seeing opportunity instead of limitations. In part, it's a reaction to Jimmy Carter's era of limitations, but there was, and in Reagan, even though he was, ran from California, was governor of California, nonetheless, his Midwestern upbringing was very, very important to him, and I think that in many ways he reflected the basic Midwestern values, of which I think Scott Walker, quite frankly, reflects as well. So in that regard, Walker also seems to be running as as an optimistic conservative. Talking more about individuality, individual rights, individual privacy, the power of the individual over the state. I don't know if he's fully formed yet. The campaign's still got a long way to go, but so I see a lot of similarities there. I also see obviously similarities, a great deal for obvious reasons, between Jeb Bush and his father. Both have a fundamental belief in government. And that's expressed by Jeb Bush's belief in Common Core and immigration reform and other things like that, where he believes that government can best solve people's problems rather than people solving them themselves. So obviously, this is shaping up. Trump is the X factor. Maybe he's like John Anderson in 1980, where John Anderson was also the X factor. People forget that in the summer of 1980, John Anderson was competitive. He was running in the 20s and even the low 30s with both Reagan and Carter running as an independent candidate. So maybe by the end, he had shrunk to about 7% and wasn't really much of a factor. And that may be Donald Trump may be the John Anderson of 1980. It remains to be seen.
Now, what's interesting is, so Governor Walker wrote this big op-ed for us at Breitbart this past week, where he walks through, and I'm going to read a quote from it really quick, is that he walks through, President Obama's agreement with the Supreme Leader of Iran threatens our safety and will be remembered as one of the greatest diplomatic failures in American history. If elected president, I would terminate the deal on day one. And he goes through for several hundred more words, walking through how he is going to, very, very clear policy prescription, where he walks through how he is adamantly opposed to this thing. On day one, he will get rid of it. We did not see such a commitment from Governor Bush on this, right? Governor Bush won't commit that he will get rid of it.
No, he's actually indicated that he would abide by the terms of the Iranian treaty, which again brings up another historical parallel, Matt, is that SALT II treaty became a huge issue in the 1980 campaign. Obviously, unemployment, inflation, high interest rates, the Cold War and our losing Cold War to the Soviets. All these things were issues in 1980. Reagan himself was an issue. Carter's competence was an issue. But so was SALT II. And Reagan said it was in the week before the election, they held one nationally televised debate, and in many ways it probably determined the outcome of the race because Reagan performed so well there. But he made it clear he was going to scrap SALT II and he would start over with what were called the START talks instead of the strategic arms limitation. He was going to start with the strategic arms reduction talks, but only after America built up her defenses and made the Soviets realize that America was serious about its national defense, was serious about the national defense of the West, and was serious about standing up to Soviet aggression. And only then did the Soviets come to the negotiating table, and Reagan got much more favorable terms than Carter got with SALT II.
And again, folks, this is Breitbart News Sunday. I'm Matthew Boyle, sitting in for Stephen K. Bannon. Our guest right now on the line is Ronald Reagan biographer Craig Shirley. Shirley, who also runs the public affairs firm, Shirley and Bannister Public Affairs. Now, Craig, one of the interesting things, and you mentioned this a few times throughout the beginning here of our chat, is that, you point back to Reagan's, Midwestern values, the populist themes that we saw out of Ronald Reagan. I think we're starting to see the same things out of Governor Walker on the campaign trail. So, in the lead up to his announcement, I'd say the most significant thing that he's done has been, and again, as a northern state governor, he never really had to deal with immigration. So he's really rethought that issue, which has really kind of emerged over the last several years as the major national issue that separates establishment Republicans from conservative outsider populists, right? And so, and Governor Walker has talked about how he wants to make sure that his focus with regard to immigration, and this is not popular inside the Beltway here in Washington, wants to make sure that his focus is on getting Americans back to work first. How big of a deal is that going to play in conjunction with this, really strong stance and contrast with the Bushes on Iran?
I think it all kind of ties together, and I think this is what explains, Matt, the success of Donald Trump right now. What nobody seems to realize is that Donald Trump's success, in large part, comes from being against the Republican establishment and the Democratic establishment. He's running, ironically, a New York billionaire real estate developer has claimed the populist mantle and is running against the very establishment that he's been a card-carrying member of for years. It remains to be seen, obviously, how long this is going to last. But he has tapped into a real anger out there at the Washington, New York political, cartel, as some people have called it. And it's fascinating to see in terms of American politics. I think Scott Walker also can take advantage of that. But it was also very much prevalent in the 1970s, and Reagan successfully tapped into that. In 1975, when he announced his challenge to Jimmy Carter, or to Gerald Ford in the Republican primaries, he held a press conference in Washington in which he railed against the lobbyists, big business, big labor, the Washington buddy system. He struck a very strong populist tone in which he was against the Republican establishment and the Democratic establishment and the media establishment and the labor establishment, and how he was going to be the avatar of the working man and the working woman who had been, as he said, overlooked. The taxpayer who supports it with their tax dollars have been overlooked by the Washington establishment. And he continued with that through the 1980 campaign, and then, of course, into his presidency as well. But the real secret to Ronald Reagan's genius was that he was always anti-establishment. He was always against the status quo. He was always set himself outside of the system. It's interesting is that Ronald Reagan was head of the national government for 8 years, and yet we never think of him as being part of the system.
Now, so looking forward to a potential general election, let's say, game out the two different, I would say probably most likely scenarios to happen here where, either Governor Bush or Governor Walker gets the nomination. Against the Hillary Clinton Democratic nominee, again, probably most likely thing to happen on the Democratic side. Now, it's not Barack Obama running for re-election like it was in 1980 where it was Jimmy Carter running for re-election, but Hillary's kind of an extension of the Obama administration. She was obviously the Secretary of State. She was involved in many of the policies here. Now, how does...
And I think Obama sees this as a referendum on his presidency, and that she's probably his... I mean, she certainly is his choice to be the vote, to determine how people view his presidency.
Now, how does all of these different things that we've talked about with regard to the differences in policies that Walker and Bush have all staked out, in a scenario where either one of them is the nominee, I mean, how does it shake out differently? If you kind of get what I'm getting at.
Excellent question. There are two majorities in America. There is a Democratic political majority, but there's a conservative governing majority. If the Republican nominee runs as a traditional Republican, like John McCain, and like Bob Dole, and like Mitt Romney, then he will lose. If he runs as a political conservative, as a cultural, economic, and political and national defense conservative, then that nominee can win. As Reagan did in 1980 and 1984, and as Richard Nixon did in 1968 and 1972. He didn't govern as a conservative, but he ran as a cultural and economic conservative. So that's the decision. And of course, the problem, the fly in the buttermilk, are the Republican consultants, because they always want to run the last campaign this time. And so I see stories about how Jeb Bush is poised to win the nomination using the Mitt Romney formula, and I just want to bury my face in my hands and say, "Oh no, not again!" So it's that somebody's got to get a hold of these Republican consultants and say, "Look, you're going to have to wake up to the fact that Republicanism isn't all that popular, but conservatism is. So you have to make sure that your nominee runs as a conservative, not as a Republican."
All right. Well, again, folks, I really want to thank you for taking the time out here on Sunday evening to talk with us, Craig. Again, folks, this is Breitbart News Sunday. We're going to take a quick commercial break. When we get back, we're going to be back with Pepperdine University professor Robert Kaufman, who's going to walk through several of these different details on the Iran deal and more to do with foreign policy in the 2016 election. We'll be right back after this.